Restrictive covenants gained favor in the early 20th century, and they forbid owners from selling, leasing, or renting their properties to non-white individuals and families. So essentially, a piece of paper could be drafted to allow for racial segregation in communities. A restrictive covenant is a legally enforceable contract that the buyer or the current owner of the property must honor, or they can be sued for breach of contract. Thus, non-whites were prevented from moving into communities. Between redlining and restrictive covenants and personal decisions to discriminate against non-whites, there was a pervasive network of patterns and policies that led to housing discrimination. In addition to this, real estate agents would steer non-whites to certain communities where their race would be able to get a loan or would be less likely to be denied a sale. In addition to this, real estate agents would steer non-whites to certain communities where their race would be able to get a loan or would be less likely to be denied a sale. There are several factors that influence segregation patterns and how groups are distributed. Discrimination in the housing market, neighborhood racial composition preferences, prejudice, and racial stereotyping, as well as differences in socioeconomic status, all play a role. We talked some already about redlining, racial steering, and also about the discriminatory practices of mortgage lenders, the insurance companies, landlords, and personal homeowners. Sometimes the sellers or the real estate agent act in a way that makes the non-white buyers uncomfortable too. We also know that as socioeconomic status changes, then people tend to acquire higher quality housing. What researchers have found, though, is that while Latinas and Asian Americans tend to live in communities that are more affluent as their socioeconomic status improves, but this tendency is not seen in blacks. This group, as their socioeconomic status improves, tends to still live in segregated and less affluent communities. Slides 9 and 10 give you an idea of the median household income for different racial groups, which in turn will help you understand the buying power for housing of these groups. You can see that the bigger income increase has been for whites and Asian Pacific Islander groups. Slide 10 allows us to consider the income differential between 1990 and 2000 for three minority groups relative to whites. Which group has gained the most during this period of time? How do you think that would affect their ability to put down money or establish a credit rating in order to buy a home? Most people exhibit what's known as in-group preference. This then begs the question, what racial composition are people comfortable with? In the 1992 to 1994 multi-city study of urban inequality, the finding was that whites are comfortable with neighborhoods that are made up with about one-third non-whites and are most comfortable with Asians for the non-white members of the neighborhood. Whites are least comfortable with blacks for neighbors. Half the respondents stated they would not be willing to move into a neighborhood that was at least one-third black. On the other hand, most minorities stated that they would be willing to move into a neighborhood that was racially integrated. Latinos and Asian Americans were more likely to choose an all-white neighborhood than the black respondents were. Residential segregation affects people's opportunities regarding access to work, access to schools, people's sense of safety and well-being, their feeling in or out of place, and their physical health. Research has shown that people gain in education and employment opportunities when they move out of segregated low-income housing projects and instead live in predominantly white suburbs. Blacks who attend racially integrated grade schools are more likely to attend colleges than those that attend more segregated high schools. Minority students in integrated schools tend to do better than their counterparts that attend segregated schools. Racially segregated neighborhoods tend to have more incidents of violence, and police response times tend to be slower in non-white neighborhoods. When neighborhoods are highly segregated, those that live there tend to experience a higher level of racism by other groups and the sense that they are out of place. Low-income neighborhoods often have limited medical as well. Studies have shown that blacks that live in segregated neighborhoods have a higher mortality rate than those that live in more integrated neighborhoods. So who are the gatekeepers for housing, and how do they wield their power? Banks and landlords are the main decision makers as to who gets in and who is kept out. Bankers, landlords, and owners have what's known as status-based power. Their power comes from their status in the social hierarchy and their ability to make decisions based on their status. Real estate agents and racial restrictive covenants have what's known as position-based power because of their actual job title and because they can exercise authority within the system of institutional discrimination. It's not uncommon still for neighborhoods, tenant councils, and parent-teacher groups to develop a strategy of organized resistance to prevent non-whites from gaining access to their neighborhoods. These figures give you an idea of the rate of home ownership by race. This comes from the 2000 census and is cited in your text. Each group is represented by the total percentage of home ownership for their group. 72% of all white households own their own home, while rates of other groups range from 40 to 53%. Because the textbook statistics are a little dated, I've included a slide that shows rates of home ownership by race on a quarterly basis. You can see that there have not been any dramatic changes in rates. There's a slight uptick from 2002 to 2005, and then a downturn back to the rates before the uptick. Overall, the statistics are about the same as the previous slide. How can we dismantle residential racial segregation? A key issue is changing our policies, not only the policies that govern the rules about selling homes, but also working with state and local policymakers. HUD should take steps to facilitate the mobility of non-whites to integrated areas by promoting the development of public housing in non-segregated areas. The Department of Justice should increase its resources and efforts to investigate and prosecute violations of housing and lending discrimination, such as racial steering and redlining. Our lawmakers in Congress should pass tougher laws against predatory lending practices, such as requiring that mortgage lenders adhere to uniform pricing standards. For all of these changes to take place, state and local governments need to be committed to finding new ways to integrate not only housing, but also schools. When schools become more integrated, that has an effect in the future on the integration of our communities.